It's never an easy task for a franchise to stick around for decades, and in the case of Capcom's Resident Evil series, they have not only managed to keep it afloat for over 20 years, but also made it continue to remain as one of, if not the most popular survival horror franchise to date. The series went through many changes throughout, but it was always able to keep up with trends as well as create trends of its own. Resident Evil 4 in specific paved the way for so many survival horror games to come and made a huge impact on the genre as a whole. Many, including myself, referred to this game as a masterpiece, but how exactly did it become one? What was the build-up to the game's major success, and what did it take to get there? In this video, I'd like to take a look back at Resident Evil 4's rough development and go over the struggles that Capcom overcame to create the game we all know and love. With that being said, here's how Resident Evil 4 became a masterpiece. The birth of the Resident Evil series was back in 1993 when development for the first Resident Evil game commenced. The director Shinji Mikami, being the legend he is, spent the first 6 months of development creating the game by himself. He would create sketches, draw out character designs, and would go on to write the first 40 pages of the script by himself. From there, a development team labeled Team Horror would step in to help out, continuing to work tirelessly on the game. Through much trial and error, after 3 years of hard work, the game was finished. Interestingly enough, Shinji Mikami didn't think the game would be successful. He thought it was too mediocre and bland to go mainstream, and only thought that the game would sell around 200,000 copies. Little did they know that the game would go on to sell nearly 3 million copies. With this major success from the first game, it was a no-brainer to continue with the series, and it was later decided that a sequel should happen. And with that thought, development had begun for Resident Evil 2 just 1 month later. But before development would start, there would be some internal reconstructing at Capcom, where development departments were turned into a multitude of numbered divisions, and a number of game directors were promoted as their leaders. The staff behind Resident Evil became Capcom Studio 4, with Mikami appointed as its general manager, changing his focus towards being a producer moving forward into Resident Evil 2. In place of the directory role, this game would be led by Hideki Kamiya instead. During the initial stages of development, Shinji Mikami often had disagreements with Hideki and tried to influence the team with his own direction. With these disagreements continuing, Mikami eventually decided it was best that he withdraw an overseeing role as the producer, and only demanded to see the latest build once monthly. With Mikami gone, production continued fully focused around Hideki's direction with the game. The first build, labeled Resident Evil 1.5, was developed, with some key differences from the game we ultimately got. These differences include unique characters, enemies, and story changes in the game. Believing the game's assets were good individually, but not yet satisfactory as a whole, Mikami expected that everything would come together in the 3 months leading up to the projected May 1997 release date. Unfortunately, all the hard work put into Resident Evil 1.5 would be meaningless. Mikami wanted Resident Evil 2 to end the series, but many people disagreed with this, and supervisor Yoshiki Akamoto even criticized the story, finding it too conclusive to allow for future installments. With this in mind, it was ultimately decided that Resident Evil 1.5 would be scrapped and rewritten. The team's explanation for this was that the game would not have reached the desired quality on time, and the gameplay and locations were dull. With all of this in mind, the development for Resident Evil 2 was restarted, and after many trials and errors, Hideki Kamiya and his team had finished the game. Just like its predecessor, Resident Evil 2 was a very successful game that even outsold RE1. With this fast-growing success, Capcom knew that they needed to capitalize on this opportunity, so from there Capcom Studio 4 decided to split their efforts into multiple Resident Evil projects, with one of them being Resident Evil 4, beginning its development in 1999. The development for Resident Evil 4 was quite the lengthy one due to many attempts at creating the game. 4 versions of the game were scrapped before Capcom went to work at creating the game we ultimately got. We start off back in 1999 at the first attempt, where director Hideki Kamiya would take the lead, the same director that worked on Resident Evil 2. Kamiya's initial idea was to create a survival horror game that was cool, stylish, and filled with action. The story revolved around solving the mystery behind the main protagonist, Tony Redgrave. Tony was created to be an invincible man with skills and a much higher intellect compared to the average human. Tony would possess superhuman abilities with the use of biotechnology. With the action-heavy approach that was planned for this game, Kamiya decided that the fixed camera angles that were used in the previous RE games wouldn't really work well with the game he was planning out. So with that thought, it was decided that the camera style for this build would be switched and replaced with a dynamic camera system. Development was going really well for this game. Teams were gathering photos for textures, concept art was being drawn, and the script was coming along nicely. They even had most of the locations drawn out, featuring many interesting settings that you typically wouldn't see in a Resident Evil game. It also looks like this Resident Evil was going to feature supernatural enemies, which is once again something we really didn't see in typical Resident Evil games. With the game being very unique in this aspect, Shinji Mikami felt that it strayed too far away from the series' survival horror roots, and gradually convinced the staff to make an independent game. The team followed through with this idea and made an entire different series out of this build, a series that many of us have all come to know and love. That series being Devil May Cry. The team kept many ideas from the Resident Evil build and expanded upon the game, and with that, the first Devil May Cry was released back in August of 2001. Now, even though Hideki Kamiya and his team were able to create a very successful game out of their build, this unfortunately meant that it was back to square one for creating Resident Evil 4. Development for a new version of Resident Evil 4 labeled the Fog version started its development near the end of 2001. In this version of the game, Hiroshi Shibata would take the leading role as director. The Fog version of RE4 took a much different approach from the previous build. In this game, it saw a returning character, Leon Kennedy, struggle to survive after having infiltrated a castle, which would be Umbrella's main headquarters. During exploration of the castle, Leon would become infected with a retrovirus that caused him to mutate over the course of the game. In the game, Leon was also planning to find a mysterious woman and her companion BOW dog imprisoned in the lab. The game also featured a brand new enemy known as the Black Fog, which was a floating mass of tentacles that would pursue Leon throughout the castle and would be responsible for Leon's infection. This build felt a lot more comparable to a typical Resident Evil game, as it had similar mechanics and even featured zombies. Overall, the game was coming together pretty well, and it was shaping to be a great addition to the mainline Resident Evil games. The build even had a trailer get released at the Tokyo Game Show back in 2002. Unfortunately, as Hiroshi and his team would get further and further into development, the team would come to discover many technological issues. The technology that was available at the time was just not advanced enough for the game. Because of this, Capcom was unable to create realistic and resource-light animations for the enemy, which forced the team to oversee changes in how the game would appear. It was ultimately decided that this build wouldn't be used for Resident Evil 4, but for a different game instead. The script for this version was handed over to Studio 2, where it was later used to create a game known as Haunting Ground, which included the imprisoned girl and the BOW dog companion. Once again, it was back to square one for Resident Evil 4. Moving into 2003, the team moved on to a new build of the game known as the Hallucination version. This new script would be left in the hands of Yasuhisa Kawamura, who was the same person who previously wrote Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. Inspired by a scene from a 2000s film titled Lost Souls, Kawamura discussed with Shibata about incorporating a hallucination element as an alternative element to BOWs. Kawamura felt that a more psychological and supernatural approach to the game would reinvigorate the series. A further idea taken from John Carpenter's The Fog was for there to be a surreal fog that engulfed Leon when enemies appeared, which would show up as a blue haze in the game. To follow the supernatural approach, Kawamura created some new terrifying enemies like possessed dolls, armor guards that came to life, and the iconic Hookman enemy that would burst out of a painting and pursue Leon. The Hookman specifically was a very intricate enemy that displayed many different mechanics during combat. Firstly, it was capable of limited teleportation as a means of catching up with the player and throwing off their aim. As the Hookman grabbed a hold of Leon, the player was able to use the game's struggle mechanic to avoid further injury. The Hookman was generally immune to gunfire. though this immunity could be turned off by environmental conditions. In the demo, this was shown as the Hookman being hurt by a flash of lightning while standing at the window, which would momentarily paralyze him and render him vulnerable. He was a very complex enemy to say the least. Programming on the game began very quickly and attempted to create a build based on all of Kawamura's ideas, and created a system to allow for seemingly random hallucinatory enemy encounters. In this game, events would occur by crossing an unseen checkpoint after performing certain tasks, like passing a certain area or exploring a new room. The game was planned to load both a normal and hallucinatory version of each room's 3D assets simultaneously, so that switching between the two would require more loading. Unfortunately, by doing this effect, it ended up using the entire 24MB RAM capacity for the GameCube, before even including all the enemy encounters. This meant that at best, the programmers would only be able to include one enemy per room. The GameCube was just not powerful enough to load all of the necessary assets, and with that conclusion, the hallucination build from Resident Evil 4 was deemed a failure, which led to Kawamura leaving the team. From there, Capcom threw one last attempt at this castle-style build, with the third build being labeled the zombie version, which saw the removal of the hallucinatory mechanics. The story was very similar to the last two previous builds, with the main difference being that the main enemy would be a zombie-like creature labeled Dabamen. These creatures would be controlled by parasitic organisms. This build began shortly after Tokyo Game Show in 2003, and quickly was stopped by Shinji Mikami because of the many concerns he had for this game. He thought the game's sales would stagnate if it were too unoriginal. With this conclusion, the zombie version was scrapped early on, and just like that, Capcom had went through 3 different builds with little results after 4 whole years. Resident Evil 4 was in a terrible state. There had been 4 years of work put into the game and they had nothing to show for it. Capcom knew that the game needed a different approach and a brand new perspective, someone who could turn this rough development around and come up with something that will take the world by storm. Shinji Mikami was put under enormous pressure by Capcom to remove Shibata from his directory roles and take over as director himself. As part of this pressure, Capcom warned him of their intention to not make any new Resident Evil titles if Resident Evil 4 did not sell well. The most recent released RE games being Resident Evil 0 and Resident Evil 1 Remake were not as successful as planned, selling below what was predicted. In a behind-the-scenes interview with Resident Evil 4 producer Hiroyuki Kobayashi, he stated that the series had been recycling the same patterns and gameplay each time. The creators were starting to get bored with it, and many moved on to other projects. Shinji Mikami talked about reshaping the series and winning back the fans, as well as winning over new fans. In order to revitalize the series, Resident Evil 4 has been given a complete makeover. Mikami had been inspired by Onimusha 3 and the camera style that was used with it. With this inspiration, he decided to place the camera behind Leon at all times, unlike the various versions from Resident Evil 3.5, which incorporated both fixed camera angles and a third-person over-the-shoulder perspective. With the game still lacking a script, Shinji Mikami created a script of his own, which was written in only 3 weeks due to limited time constraints. Continuing on from the zombie version of Resident Evil 4, which was the build that included zombie-like enemies, the game introduced the Ganados, which were once normal humans that became infected with the parasite that eventually took full control over the host. The Ganados would be much more advanced compared to a typical zombie, being able to run, dodge, and wield melee and projectile weapons. They were also capable of following complex instructions and were able to work together. With the game's action-focused approach, Mikami introduced a laser sight and an over-the-shoulder aim to give players an unprecedented amount of control in their attacks. During these attacks, enemies would respond differently to bullet impacts from different parts of the body. A shot to the foot may cause an approaching enemy to stumble, while a shot to the arm might make the enemy drop their weapon. The game would feature a massive amount of enemies that would drop lots of ammunition for Leon to collect. With all the extra ammunition to hold, a new inventory management system was introduced, an attache case that allowed the player plenty of inventory space for holding weapons, health, and ammunition. Another new feature that was added to RE4 was QuickTime events and player interaction mechanics. Based on the situation, the player can interact with specific aspects of their environment. This could include kicking down a ladder, jumping out of a window, kicking open a door, or even dodging an enemy attack. RE4 also makes much more use of the knife compared to other titles, as significant damage can be dealt with minor risk of taking damage. Resident Evil 4 used fully three-dimensional in-game graphics. The in-game scenes and movies were rendered in real time. This allowed for a mobile camera, a change from most of the previous games in the series, which used the pre-rendered, occasionally animated backdrops with superimposed 3D characters. In an interview, background artist Yusuke Kan went into further detail about the game's graphics, stating, "Up until now, we have made our pre-rendered backgrounds very intricate and detailed, but now we have actual moving backgrounds and we are focusing more on the presence, the realism, and having more fun moving around. The biggest thing of course would be that the environments are much more expansive. We also had to integrate the indoor and outdoor areas, blending each area or section of the game seamlessly. This was quite a challenge to take on. The game's visuals and attention to detail were praised by many, and it has been described as the best looking GameCube title. Overall, it's fair to say that the development for this final build of Resident Evil 4 went pretty smooth, and after 2 years of hard work, Resident Evil 4 was released on the GameCube back in January 11th of 2005. Following the success of Resident Evil 4 on the GameCube, a port for the PS2 followed shortly after, getting an official release on October 25th of 2005. With these two releases, Resident Evil 4 went on to be named Game of the Year at the 2005 Spike Video Game Awards. Resident Evil 4 went on to become nominated and win many awards throughout the years, with its most recent being the VR port winning 2021 VR Game of the Year at the 2021 Game Awards. RE4 went on to be ported to pretty much everything, even getting a mobile port released back in July 27th of 2009. The GameCube version sold over 320,000 copies in North America during the first 20 days. The European release sold its entire 200,000 copies during the first month. By December of 2005, 3 million copies of the GameCube and PlayStation 2 versions had been shipped worldwide. According to January 17th of 2007 sales figured by Capcom, the GameCube version of Resident Evil 4 has sold a total of 1.6 million copies worldwide, while the PS2 version had sold over 2 million copies. As of December 2021, Resident Evil 4 has sold at least 11.4 million copies across multiple platforms. It is the second best-selling RE game and holds the record for the best-selling survival horror game in the 2012 Guinness World Records Gamer Edition. Resident Evil 4 is regarded as one of the most influential games of the 2000s due to its influence in redefining the third-person shooter genre. The new gameplay alterations and the immersive style appeal to many not previously familiar with the series. The over-the-shoulder camera style introduced in Resident Evil 4 has later become a standard in third-person shooters and action games, being used in titles like Gears of War and Batman Arkham Asylum. RE4's introduction of the precision aim also became a standard in many third-person action games to come, including Dead Space, Grand Theft Auto, Mass Effect, and The Last of Us. Resident Evil 4 redefined the survival horror genre by emphasizing reflexes and precision aiming, thus broadening the gameplay of the series with elements from the wider action game genre. However, this also led to some reviewers to suggest that the Resident Evil series had abandoned the survival horror genre by demolishing the genre conventions that it had established. Other major survival horror franchises followed suit by developing their combat systems to feature more action, such as Silent Hill Homecoming and the 2008 version of Alone in the Dark. These changes represent an overall trend among console games, shifting towards visceral action gameplay. Resident Evil 4 is truly a game that paved the way for many games to come, which is exactly why it is referred to by many as one of the greatest games of all time.